Hello and welcome to the something looks different in here and I don't know what it is. Hmm. Let me try. No, do we I don't know how any of this stuff works. But anyway, hello and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box, where for whatever reason I'm in the dark, but today we are trying our very best to enlighten the world about a very important subject. And this is the greatest composer of all time, not just in my estimation, but in the estimation of Richard Wagner, who himself has a very strong claim to that position. And Wagner bowed before no one in the world of composition or conducting, but he did bow before Beethoven. For him, and I'm fully with him on this, Beethoven was the fulcrum. Beethoven was the revolutionary. Beethoven was that line in the sand where Western European, call it what you will, classical music was reinvigorated. It was reborn. It was made new again. It was made meaningful. It was made elaborate, but all of it justified through artistic merit and brilliance. And Beethoven, of course, composed in so many different media. We're going to talk today primarily about his symphonies, but he composed chamber music, he composed great concerti, particularly for piano, and also he did his great violin concerto. He did wonderful, wonderful piano sonati. He did an opera. There were great overtures taken from it. He could do it all, but I do think that he's probably remembered most as the great symphonist, really the greatest symphonist of all time. And today we're not going to talk about why his composition is so important. We're going to talk about why the way in which his symphonies are performed is so very, very important, and why Beethoven performance has been murdered over the last 50 years or so. And so that's why, if you were a youngster, a person who's maybe even old, but a novice in terms of really digging deep into the classical music repertoire, into various kinds of performances, you might have heard a Beethoven symphony performed live. You may have heard a recording of it, a rather recent recording, and said, this isn't all that great. Some might even say this is boring, and there is a reason for that, because Beethoven has been murdered, and when you murder a musician in terms of how his music is performed, you suck all the life out of it. You make it boring, bland, blasé, fill in whichever stupid adjectives you want. And there are some very specific reasons for it. So let's go back to the age of Beethoven himself. Musical performance in the age of Beethoven was barely professionalized, and in a lot of cases, it relied fully on amateur performances. All of the great philharmonic orchestras, the great symphony orchestras, whose names are very well known today, Berliner Philharmoniker, Vienna Philharmoniker, Concertgebouw Orchestra, London Symphony Orchestra, Chicago Symphony, Philadelphia Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, all of these larger than life names, they were really, really not around in Beethoven's era. He long preceded them. And he wasn't that far removed from the age where most musical performance existed at the behest of a benefactor. And I'm talking about secular music, because before that, and the roots of all European classical music are liturgical. That was the place where the ordinary person could hear music in Catholic and Protestant churches. Orthodox churches do not have instrumental music, they have chanting. Russians have polyphonic chanting, or at least they have since around the 16th and 17th centuries. And a lot of the Greek and Levantine Orthodox churches have monophonic chant, which sounds very distinctive. I've done a video on that. Definitely check that out. It's both spiritually moving and very beautiful. So check that out. But in terms of European classical music, it was the instrumental and harmonic traditions of Catholicism, and after the 16th century, the Protestant churches like Lutheranism and Anglicanism, just to name two, that are the basis of modern secular classical European music. And so who was funding it at the time? Well, it wasn't ticket sales, it wasn't streaming. It was aristocrats and maybe a few gentry types. It was the people with influence and money. And where do we get the word chamber music from? Well, the chamber of a great aristocratic manor is where performances were played. And even once symphonies started to get bigger and operas started to get bigger, the opera houses and what passed for concert halls in the 18th and early 19th century, they were all done at the behest of some sort of aristocratic or gentry type patron. Now, that was the reality of Beethoven's era. Music was becoming more public, but it was still something that was rather constricted and restricted to small venues with amateurish musicians. And this became very poignant during Beethoven's era because Beethoven's compositions were vastly more demanding than anything that came before him. The level of musical excellence demanded by Beethoven was just otherworldly. Mozart was a big departure from Haydn in this respect, but Beethoven was that much more of an exponential departure from Mozart in terms of the skill, the virtuosity required by the musicians. And so while Beethoven was beloved in his own time for all the right reasons, his pieces in his own era almost certainly never got the hearing that they really deserved, in the sense that they never really were performed as well as they ought to be. Over the decades, this started to change, and people were already talking about the need to change it, one of whom was Richard Wagner. He wrote all about his experiences in this regard in his masterful essay on conducting. Now, Wagner's sort of eureka moment came in the 1830s when he visited Paris. And it was here that he heard the granddaddy of them all, the great Beethoven's Ninth, conducted by the French conductor Jean-Francois Antoine Habernac. He's someone whose name isn't as renowned today as subsequent generations, but Wagner was impressed by Habernac's conducting because his orchestra was disciplined, virtuosic. The tempi had this lush rubato. Tempo rubato simply means when the tempo is flexible and changes quite frequently in accordance to the melodic and harmonic development of the piece. It's an essential part of European classical music, and it's the most important thing that differentiates European classical music from classical traditions of other countries. In, let's say, the Indian raga, in the Indonesian gamelan, in the master drumming of Ghana and West Africa, in traditional Chinese folk music and Japanese folk music, it's the rhythm that guides and informs the harmony and the melody. In European classical music, it is the harmony and the melody that guides the rhythm. And the way that process displays itself, displays is the wrong word, but, makes itself heard, I suppose we should say, is through this tempo rubato. And so all of these refinements that are so essential in European classical music, but that were lacking in a lot of the amateurish ensembles of the day, Wagner heard this in 1830s Paris under the baton of Habernac. And he set out to make Germanic orchestras the finest in the world. After all, Beethoven was German, Wagner was German, and he felt that the music of Beethoven and of others was not given the presentation that it needed. So Wagner and others started developing the modern Central European Germanic school of conducting. And it was designed to do many things, but one of which was to allow Beethoven's music to be played the way that it couldn't have been played in his own lifetime due to limitations. Beethoven died in the 1820s, just to give people some context there. By the 1840s and 50s, the Wagnerian tradition was in full flight. What did this mean? Orchestras were becoming, and were by then, professionalized. Members of orchestras were virtuosic. The instruments played in the orchestras were better constructed. Their manufacturing was more precise. They sounded better. They could do more things. Their versatility increased. The size of the orchestra increased, giving more dynamic scale and more sort of weight and gravitas to the way the orchestra sounded. And conductors had transformed from being people whose great achievement was getting through an evening to being the people who took an equally important role to the composer. I'll say that again because that's so important. Equally important role to the composer in creating a living and breathing artistic experience for an audience. And Wagner wrote all about this great tradition that had existed before his time, but that was refined and exponentially improved during Wagner's time. Wagner talked about the traditions of rubato being implicit and intrinsic to European classical music. He talked about the need for tempo to follow the emotional depth and realism within a piece. That, in other words, it wasn't just enough to have rubato. You needed to have a rubato that was harmoniously linked, if you'll pardon the turn of phrase, to the melody and the harmony and the Geist, the spirit, as the Germans would say, of the music itself. And I strongly encourage you to read the essay because it really is the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of modern European orchestral and, frankly, all of classical music presentation. Wagner, though, was very careful to say, look, this isn't being invented. This isn't being done for the sake of it. This is the essence of European classical music. And you can go back, including to Beethoven's time and before, and read the descriptions of how this, in the perfect settings, or at least the settings approximating perfection, how things were performed in this way, but that due to a lack of professionalism and unevenness in terms of performance quality throughout the classical music world, things didn't always work out the way they should, even though when they did, things were absolutely monumental, and that the goal that mid-19th century conductors and performers should strive for is making it as close to perfect every single time. And since Beethoven was the father or godfather, if you will, of modern European orchestral performance, Wagner focused heavily on Beethoven and on Beethoven's Ninth, his most monumental, towering work, to emphasize these points. Wagner himself worked with and trained some of the finest conductors of all time. People like von Bülow, people later on like Nikesh, people whose names were sort of the household names before recorded sound. Von Schillings was around, even though he lived into the age of recorded sound. So you can actually hear Max von Schillings conduct some of the music that we're talking about. But this grand Wagnerian tradition was something that was and ought still to be implicit in European performance. In other words, you shouldn't be able to separate this style of performance from Beethoven, because even though Wagner was a successor to Beethoven, what he did was take all of the elements of Beethoven's era that were let's just say, for lack of a better word, authentic, and he rarefied them and improved them in such a way that it gave audiences in most big cities throughout the world a chance to hear the real Beethoven. Um, and so by this time, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, you have the rise of professional orchestras. All of those names that I mentioned earlier in the video: Berlin, Vienna, Concertgebouw of Amsterdam, the major ones in London, which always had competing orchestras, the big ones in the United States: Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, New York. These orchestras became, by the end of the 19th century, established as the creme de la creme. And the conductors who arose out of the generation following Wagner are unique because they were the first generation of conductors to be recorded. They lived into the recorded age, even though just about all of them were born before. Think of people like Wilhelm Furtwängler, associated with the Berlin Philharmonic, which he led between the early 1920s and his death in 1954. Think of Wilhelm Mengelberg, the man who built the Concertgebouw up from a nothing to one of the finest orchestras of all time. He led the Concertgebouw from the late 19th century right up to 1945. These two men in particular, there are many others, but those two have always stood in my mind as the two titans of this Wagnerian conducting school, who fortunately have a great deal of recordings because they lived well into the recorded age. In Furtwängler's case, he was still conducting into the high fidelity age, although he made comparatively few high fidelity recordings. Most of his great recordings were either pre-war or just after the war. But look, we have them recorded. And that's very special because imagine if we had performances when Wagner was alive recorded. That would be great. But hearing people like Furtwängler and Mengelberg and others, people like Max von Schillings as well, people of that generation, it really is. It's kind of like a time machine. It's just about touching the era of Wagner, which was that era when Beethoven came alive, and that this high professional standard with the rubato, with the large orchestras, with the perfect style of instruments, it was that era. So all of great European classical orchestras that we sort of can learn about by looking at film and reading reviews and listening to recordings from the first half of the 20th century. This was all of a reflection of the Wagnerian era of the 19th century. So, what did that mean for performances of Beethoven? It meant they were emotionally authentic. It meant they were dramatic. It meant that they told sonic stories. It meant that they were the zenith of emotional grandeur and intimacy at the same time. It meant specifically that tempo wasn't steady and metronomic. It fluctuated just as the emotional messaging of the works themselves fluctuated. It meant you had large orchestras, loads of strings, loads of winds and brass, modern percussion, creating sounds that were sonorous and beautiful and just off the charts amazing. And it meant that you really had virtually mistake-free performances by these great orchestras. And when you listen to Beethoven conducted in this authentic way, it is very hard to disagree with Wagner's assessment that Beethoven is this Mac Daddy, if you will, of composers, the greatest of all. So what went wrong? Who murdered Beethoven? Well. In around the 60s and 70s, a very small movement that no one paid attention to started to sprout up in the world of classical music. And this was called the Historically Informed Performance Tradition, or HIP. And they actually, ironically, did the opposite of what they claimed to do. They claimed that they were playing music of Beethoven and others in the way that it would have been played in Beethoven's own day. But in doing so, they kind of did the opposite. They looked at various metronome markings on the pages of the scores, and they adhered to those rigidly, ignoring the fact that authors and commentators on music in Beethoven's own day wrote about the fact that the music was many times much more slow and deliberate than the tempo markings, and that there was lots of rubato. There wasn't this rigid adherence to tempo. They ignored that. They ignored Wagner and everything he wrote about conducting and about performance, to say, no, everything he's saying about the great traditions of European music, we're just going to ignore those, and we're going to rush through Beethoven at tempo markings that clearly made no sense according to the very people around during and shortly after Beethoven's time, and according to the great conductors who received the oral tradition of European classical performance, which dated back to Beethoven's time. Again, people like Nigesch, von Schillings, Furtwängler, Mengelberg. They ignored that great oral tradition, which is such an important part of musical history, and one that we were lucky enough to at least have much of it from the late from late 19th century luminaries recorded in the early 20th century when they were still very much alive, well, and doing their thing. Um, these hipsters, let's call them, historically informed performance idiots, they sucked all of the life out of Beethoven, and they did it for several reasons. One, ideology. They were repulsed by the improvisational qualities inherent in rubato. They got embarrassed by the emotional honesty of people like Furtwängler and Mengelberg. They also were quite selfish because most people in this historically informed movement are very mediocre musicians who don't really have the virtuosic ability to play the music in its proper Wagnerian style. And to show how they had the intent and the effect of rewriting history, they took the actual authenticity that Wagner was striving for and wrote about in very clear language, and his successors put this on acetate and shellac and other recorded formats, tape even at the very end, so that we can all hear it. They said, no, 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 we're the authentic ones, not them. And what was the result? The result of what they called authentic was manifestly inauthentic, but the music was ugly. It was plain. It was boring. They filled up modern concert halls with tiny little orchestras, small orchestras that may have sounded big in the chamber of an aristocratic manner, but which sound quiet and thin and lifeless in a modern concert hall, because of course the grand age of Wagnerian orchestras was also the age where musical performance was democratized. You had the great concert halls and opera houses being built, and the music industry became an industry that sustained itself on things like the sale of printed music, of sheet music, of ticket sales. It was an industry, but it was one that revolutionized classical music insofar as it democratized it. So these hipsters put these tiny orchestras in big concert halls, which itself makes no sense. They play on instruments that are supposed recreations of the pre-Wagnerian instruments. They all sound like shit. By most account, well, by many scholarly accounts, they sound worse than the instruments of Beethoven or even Mozart and Haydn's time. And possibly worst of all, they play it all too fast and with no variation in the tempo. If they play it like it's sort of a march, a half-assed march, and it's boring, it's excruciating. I've walked out of some of these concerts after being duped into them, not knowing what they would be. And the sad reality is, pardon me, that many, if not most, Beethoven performances of today are informed by these historically informed morons. And because of that, it is very rare to hear a performance of a Beethoven symphony that is truly authentic, however they might protest to the contrary. So, what is there to do? Well, go back to these great recordings of Furtwängler and Mengelberg, and not just their Beethoven recordings, but that's a very good place to start. Listen to all of their recordings and others of their contemporaries and see how it differs, see how it is engaging and exciting and sonorous, even on what in some cases are primitive recording technologies, even in spite or despite that, I should say. The beauty, the sincerity, the authenticity, the magnetism, the unput downable qualities of it are so very much there. And when you compare and contrast that to these sort of hip and post-hipster performances, you think, well, what the hell went wrong? And several things are the answers. One is communism, and particularly Western European style communism, because the Soviets kind of ignored it in their own way. But even though they were very communist, but once you got these communists infiltrate, I mean, I know I sound a bit like Joe McCarthy, but bear with me, folks. Once you got these communists infiltrating the scholarly criticism of music and music composition itself, the idea that music of a high caliber should be for the masses, this Wagnerian ideal, it fell out of favor, and instead music became something that went back to the chamber. Only this time, instead of being the aristocratic chamber, it was the much more drab academic chamber. Music, particularly European classical music, was taken away from the masses. The masses in Europe and America were robbed of their great tradition. Other countries didn't really pay attention to it. The Soviet Union, like I said, kept this large, grandiose tradition alive far longer. In places to this day, like China, Japan, and India, European classical music in its robust form is very much appreciated. There is a major Furtwängler society in Japan. In China, people admire these performances. But Europe, where the music originated, and America being a child of Europe, it was robbed from these audiences by people using a very controversial and deadly ideology, or at least an offshoot of communism, to make music something that was very banal, overly academic, overly ponderous, and rather than grand, universal, beautiful, meaningful, something tied to the experiences and the background and the culture and the emotions of the audience listening to it. And as a result, Beethoven, long after his natural death, was murdered. Um, Classical music in general declined in popularity a lot in Europe and North America. I would say for many reasons, but I would say one of the reasons was because of this. They sucked the life out of it. Very sad, very tragic. And what all you can do really is listen to these great performances, be moved by them, fall in love with them. Remember that Beethoven can be, if he's killed by this ideology, then he can be resurrected by listening to these great performances. Phone a friend, tell them all about it, share them widely. And I don't mean to sound like I'm proselytizing, but if you want to, get people to realize that European classical music is not what has been recorded over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years or so, go back to these recordings that have a direct cultural oral connection to the eras of Beethoven and Wagner, and you will see that it is some of the most exciting and riveting music that you have ever heard. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.